So first I'll tell you a little bit about associated content. Associated content, we like to think, is the web's largest open content network and platform. We have approaching 2 million pieces of content, 250,000 content producers or sources, as we refer to them, and growing. We add about 2,500 pieces of content to the web each day, copyright protected, unique to us. And we really think, when you look at the content production cycle and the efficiencies of content production and content that is authentic, that is produced by a whole gamut of different kinds of people, and I'll walk through how those users or content producers are identified and segmented. But I was going to walk through sort of a couple of things, excuse me, that I think web publishing now unequivocally demands. One is math and science. And social media, by context, needs to think about math and science as well, whether you're Facebook or the New York Times or a consumer brand, really thinking about sort of the ones and zeros behind the publishing, the content, how it's driven through search, all of the components that are really key here. As someone who spent several years at Google, this is something that's very important to me, and I make sure that there's pretty clear analytics to everything that we do with regards to publishing, paying for, and making content accessible. Secondly is this notion of agile programming, getting back to scale. When you have 250,000 content producers, you can very quickly produce content and develop content on myriad subjects, whether it's on behalf of a sponsor or on behalf of a user base or just really smart programming. Being agile, I think, is super important. Thirdly is a notion of sort of custom content marketplaces, and I'll walk through what I really mean by this, but we essentially built associated content to do for content what eBay did for commerce, build an open content marketplace, one that people can contribute into and derive value from. Community and discussion, these things are fairly obvious, but when you look at content production and content development, I think far too often publishers, writers, authors are very fearful of the kind of conversation that can be built upon content that can be created. We say you absolutely need to embrace that. Last few things are obvious. I mean, monetization is sort of what keeps the lights on everywhere, but search engine optimization, discoverability, doing everything that you can in the most upfront, transparent way to make sure that your content is fresh, that your content is linked, and that your content is discoverable through search. I learned this in many different careers, but it's profound how this has even increased over time, especially as Google approaches 70% search share in the US. So what do I mean by a content marketplace? I mean, I think we all know eBay. We all know that you can buy and sell Pez dispensers and everything else under the sun on eBay. Why can't content be thought of in that same way? Why can't content be evaluated by a system that not only takes user interest, but also the opportunity for monetization? So those are just some of the examples that we think in respect to content, and you can get much greater scale and much greater audience when you build a marketplace that doesn't try to define to a user or define to a publisher of content what is valuable, what is useful, and what is going to be most monetizable and interesting to a user. So, I didn't walk out of Google with the algorithm, but, this is an interesting kind of true algorithm when you look at the definition of quality. I know I was asked to talk about scale, but I think there's another thing with regard to social content and community that is far too often a fearful place. I think Jory mentioned the notion of a clean, well-lit place for advertisers. We absolutely think about that as well, but I think advertisers, brands, agencies, et cetera, need to redefine and rethink the definition of quality and how quality is defined. I really think that quality should be defined as useful. Those are just three very abstract versions and definitions of quality from Tom Friedman, a professional journalist from the New York Times writing about the economy, writing about what is important to him with respect to our economy, the recession, et cetera. Or a mom in Iowa who writes about the economy that maybe got laid off from her job and spends $100 a week on groceries and spent $300 a week a few months ago, and her wonder how that affects the local grocery chain or Kroger's or something like that. Maybe not written with the most professional voice that you would see from a Tom Friedman or anyone else from the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, but authentic and useful to a user. Lastly, the blogger in their underpants. I mean, what are they writing about? What's interesting to them? Is it sort of the World of Warcraft? Is it something else? But, excuse me, the definition of sort of quality only equaling professionally trained journalist, I think needs to be thrown out the window. We see it in our business every day. If the content is useful and if the user gets the right outcome from accessing, engaging in, and answering a question or finding a piece of information or solving a problem, that to me is useful. And that to me needs to be defined as quality versus a world of clean, well-lit places that only brands are going to be familiar with and comfortable with over time. Excuse me. In terms of, again, that new definition of quality, this actually looks at a couple of different definitions as opposed to what you might be looking at before. The sort of green example would be your standard publisher. And this gets to really the sort of new definition of what scale looks like in terms of publishing and content creation. You know, if you have a team of hundreds of journalists or 30 journalists or 40, how could you really create content that's going to satisfy a user audience? How is it going to satisfy a large population of people? So this is just some of the examples of our content when you look at associated content. You know, we have 1,500 different themes. We have thousands and tens of thousands of different categories. So being able to produce at that scale and produce information that's going to reach that kind of scale. And as I mentioned, with us producing and putting thousands of pieces of content on the web each day, I don't think when you look at content creation and the standard content ecosystem that most publishers are building, when you're really tapping a community of the web and tapping a community of users, you're absolutely going to be able to see lightning in a bottle and growth. So this is our proverbial sort of internal version of the long tail. You know, if you look at sort of the kind of content that's out there in terms of on the far blue side here, the sort of head of the tail, if you will, is pieces of content that might see 1 million page views, on down to pieces of content that see far less than that. But the scale that you create content on, I think, is interesting to look at as well. When I look at our library, 90% of our content is viewed at least once a month. So that, when you look at sort of content creation and scale, there's actually scale of usage within each of those categories, which I think is just fascinating. So the value of a library, the value of your content, and making sure that content is not perishable, I think is important as well. And we have lots of brands that want to surround themselves with content that I remember producing content when we were at CBS and other places that would only say, I want only the freshest content. I only want content that's been produced in the last week, the last month, et cetera. I think that's sort of a myopic view of what the value is of content. And if a piece of content was produced in 2005 or 2006, if it's useful to a user, it can ultimately be useful to an advertiser as well. So I'm going to finish with a little notion of sort of what you should do and how you should think about kind of content creation and also scale with respect to community. So math and science, I mean, that's not dummy information. That's the sort of dashboards and algorithms that we place against how users consume, how social is our content, how engaging is our content from our users. Again, this notion of multiple sources and mining and taking ownership of a library, agile programming, making sure that you're ready to produce content, to produce information that's going to engage a community in a big way. So you need to be able to be fast and agile with how you create that content. This is sort of, you know, the fundamentals of content creation today. It's almost sort of unnecessary to discuss, but you have to make sure all the content that you create is Facebooked and digged and stumbled upon and every other tool that can be utilized to promote that content. And incentivizing your content creators, again, when we're looking at 250,000, we want to make sure that all of those content creators are as social as they can be with their content creation. And then lastly, these last two components, it needs to be search engine optimized. You need to be transparent. You need to be upfront. You can't be doing nefarious things with Google. We all have experience with companies that have. So making sure that you're transparent, making sure that you're as upfront with the discoverability of all of the engines out there is absolutely critical. Again, that's just sort of basic fundamental stuff. And then lastly, I think, is trying to think about how you can get your community to produce for you and really building these marketplaces of content creation that can ultimately define value for you and build new communities that you didn't even think could have existed before.